They say queens won their battles in daylight. But the real wars were fought by the hands pouring their wine. Secrets moved through the palace long before the king ever sensed a shift. Carried by servants who were never meant to matter. A whisper could tilt a marriage. A glance could end a reign. And a silence could bury a woman without a single accusation. Tonight, you will walk beside those unseen hands and feel how quietly power changed its shape. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment, letting me know what time it is, where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one listens long enough in a Tudor household, the truth seldom comes from the throne. It rises instead from the softest corners of the rooms where no one looks. From the quiet movements of people whose faces few remember. The king may have commanded the palace, and the queen may have held her dignity like a shield. But it was the servants who moved through the small corridors where secrets learned to breathe. Their steps were steady, their eyes lowered, their hands busy with linen and wood and silver. Yet nothing escaped them. Not the trembling of a mistress's fingers. Not the hesitation in a queen's sigh. Not the faint rustle of fabric when someone waited too long at the wrong door. In those narrow spaces, truth came gently, almost politely. It did not shout. It brushed past a shoulder, whispered behind a curtain, clung to a sleeve still warm from another person's skin. Servants carried these fragments without effort. As naturally as breath, they swept the floors and collected the dust. But they also swept the conversations drifting above their heads. They folded clothing and tucked away not just fabric, but the scent of someone who had visited too late in the night. Their work was constant, unglamorous, and visible. And precisely because of that, they became the palace's quiet pulse. No king ever heard the first ripple of scandal. Not truly. That privilege belonged to those who walked silently behind him. A maid brushing a mistress's hair at dawn could detect the faint sourness of anxiety trapped in her skin. A footman tending to the queen's chambers could hear muffled weeping behind a partition and know instantly that the next weeks would be tense. A laundress soaking linens could tell from a single stain that a secret meeting had taken place despite every precaution. The palace believed itself to be divided, the queen's rooms on one side, the mistresses on the other, and the king drifting between them like some restless tide. But the servants belonged to neither world. They slipped through both with hands full of tasks and minds sharpened by necessity. They observed the people they served with, an attention born not from loyalty but from survival. Understanding the moods of their superiors meant avoiding punishment. Reading the atmosphere meant staying a step ahead of danger. Knowledge was a form of protection, and those who had the most survived the longest. It was easy for nobles to overlook them. A servant delivering water did not appear to listen. A maid fastening a gown seemed entirely absorbed by the fabric. A boy tending the hearth had eyes lowered toward the flames. But each of them absorbed every detail. The lowered voice, the sudden silence, the way a mistress glanced at the door before speaking. Even a poorly concealed tremor in the king's tone gave them more information than he ever intended. The queen relied on them without admitting it. Her dignity forbade confrontation with a rival. Her status required distance, composure, and restraint. But her servants could move where she could not. They entered the rooms she would never step into. They touched the clothing of the woman, and she could not openly accuse. They witnessed the rhythms of a life she was expected to ignore. And the moment something felt wrong, an extra visitor, a missing ribbon, a door left unlocked, they felt it before she did. Servants developed an instinct for patterns. They recognized when footsteps lingered too long outside a chamber. They noticed when someone avoided certain hallways. They could tell when the king's temper carried a different weight, when a mistress smiled too sweetly, when the queen's posture stiffened just slightly more than usual. They were not formally trained observers. Yet they were the best observers the palace possessed. Rumours were born in these small spaces, not from malice, but from the simple accumulation of details. A murmured name, a hurried step, a piece of jewellery misplaced in the wrong room. Servants carried these details in their memories, letting them piece together a portrait the royals themselves never wanted to see. Kings imagined themselves omniscient. Queens imagined themselves watchful. But the truth always reached the servants first. Power in the Tudor court was loud. Knowledge was quiet, and far more dangerous. What made their awareness potent was not what they said, but what they did not say. Their silence was the first veil over every unfolding scandal. Servants understood that information held too tightly could burn, but information released with care could alter fates. They had no titles, no wealth, no protection, but they possessed something rarer, the first thread of every story, the beginning of every downfall, the earliest tremor of every shift in the palace's delicate balance. Even the walls felt different when servants understood something the nobles did not. A charged stillness settled over certain corridors. A door would close with slightly more caution. A glance between two maids during supper would stretch a moment too long. They lived close to the center of danger, yet also just outside the reach of blame. They could not influence the storm, but they were the first to smell the air before it broke. Perhaps the most chilling truth is that the people who seemed least significant were the first to witness the unraveling of others. They could predict which mistress would fall from favor long before the king realized he was growing bored. They knew when the queen felt threatened long before she spoke the thought aloud. They sensed the tightening of political knots before any nobleman had time to adjust his smile. Nothing moved in the palace without brushing against them. And though they rarely spoke, their silence shaped the unseen structure of court life. It was not the king who heard the first whisper of danger. It was the one polishing the silver beside the open doorway. The quiet drift of their awareness carried more weight than any proclamation. Something subtle always shifted when they noticed too much. And once that shift began, even the stillest room held its breath for what might stir next. They moved through the great houses with a quiet certainty, slipping past thresholds that others treated as borders. Doors did not resist them. Rooms did not question their presence. Their passage was woven into the rhythm of the building itself, as natural as drafts sliding beneath the floorboards. A queen might hesitate before crossing into the king's chambers, and a mistress might steal along dim corridors with held breath. But servants walked without earning a single raised brow. Their footsteps belonged everywhere, and to no one. Their hands carried objects, but their eyes carried knowledge. They stepped into private rooms while their owners still slept, adjusting curtains that framed lives they were never meant to witness. They slipped into dressing spaces thick with perfume and silk, where whispered secrets clung to the air like dust motes. They tended the beds in which alliances were sealed and undone. They refreshed the hearths beside which confessions accidentally spilled. Every small chore placed them at the heart of something intimate, something vulnerable, something that revealed far more than the people inside wished to admit. This freedom of movement, so ordinary, so unremarked, made them more dangerous than any noble suspected. They crossed from the queen's chambers to the mistresses with the same steady hands, the same blank expression, the same quiet competence. They did not need to pry. The architecture of the palace fed them everything. A misplaced glove, a hurriedly folded robe, the faint trace of someone who had visited too late. All of it gathered silently into their awareness. The palace believed itself divided between the rightful wife and the favoured lover. But its walls did not honour those lines, and neither did the servants. They understood patterns in ways the household never intended. They knew which corridors remained warm long after someone passed through them. They sensed when voices carried tension, even if the words were polite. They recognized the way a slammed drawer hinted at fear, or how a half-finished meal revealed a restless night. their familiarity with the building's breathing, the opening of windows, the stirring of ashes, the shifting of fabric, gave them a map more accurate than any held by its noblest residents. Where others saw routine, they saw movement. Where others saw stillness, they saw absence. Their lives depended on reading these subtleties, and so they read them with ruthless precision. A servant who misread a mood could lose their position. One who read it correctly could navigate through danger with ease. And so they watched, and listened, and passed through rooms with the sensitivity of someone who knew that survival was written in the smallest gestures. Servants witnessed the household not from a distance, but from inches away. They tied laces around trembling ribs. They carried basins still warm from someone's breath. They brushed fabric over skin marked with anxieties unspoken. They saw the queen exhausted by doubt, and the mistress trembling with hope she dared not voice. No royal ever moved through the house without touching the edges of their awareness. Their freedom was subtle, quiet, unquestioned. Yet it granted them the kind of access that shaped entire fates. And still, they remained invisible. Nobles rarely met their eyes, assuming that invisibility also meant ignorance. But servants remembered everything, not because they intended to, but because their work forced them to witness the private decay of certainty. They were the only ones who could move from room to room without drawing suspicion. And in that freedom lay a power no title could match. They left no trace behind them. Yet the building always shifted when they passed. They understood the household more deeply than those who claimed to rule it. And the deeper that understanding grew, the more quietly the walls began to lean towards secrets waiting to be stirred. She was expected to master stillness long before she mastered anything else. A Tudor wife, especially one who held the title of queen or noble consort, lived within a framework built not of stone, but of expectations. Every movement she made was weighed, every expression measured, every glance judged by a court eager to read, meaning where none had been offered. To act directly was to risk accusation. To confront openly was to reveal vulnerability. And so she learned the art of distance, the discipline of appearing untouched by whatever threatened her position. Even when jealousy tightened around her breath or suspicion stirred beneath her ribs, she could not step into the hallways where her husband's mistress laughed too brightly. She could not place her ear to the doors where whispers gathered. She could not let her anger darken her voice in front of a watching court. The dignity tied to her status did not permit such displays. It demanded she remain serene, composed, and unshaken, even as the foundations beneath her shifted. Etiquette bound her more firmly than any chain. The rituals of the palace dictated when she spoke, whom she greeted, where she walked, and how far she could stray from her assigned chambers. Servants moved more freely than she did. Ambassadors had more access to private spaces. Even distant cousins of the king could drift through the palace without raising concern. But she, the lawful wife, was confined by the invisible walls of propriety. Any attempt to observe the mistress directly would be interpreted as pettiness, insecurity, or even political weakness. The court was always hungry for signs of fracture. A single misplaced gesture could bloom into a scandal. If she appeared in a corridor where the king's mistress lingered, tongues would begin to wag before she finished her next breath. If she asked too many questions, it would be said she lacked trust. If she followed too closely, it would be said she lacked grace. And if she displayed even the smallest trace of resentment, it would confirm the rumors that she was losing her influence. Such dangers meant she could not risk proximity. To maintain her image, she had to remain above the daily conflicts that quietly tore at her position. She had to embody the ideal of the virtuous wife, calm, patient, and dignified, while the world around her whispered about the woman who shared her husband's affection. Her composure became both armor and prison. There was also a deeper, more private truth. Confrontation could not guarantee victory. A mistress might cry, collapse, or manipulate sympathy. A king might defend his infatuation. Courtiers might take sides without waiting for facts. The wife, bound by her rank, would be blamed no matter the outcome. She could not control the narrative if she stepped into it too boldly. To protect herself, she had to remain outside the frame, and so she let silence become her strategy. She let distance become her shield. She walked through her chambers with steady hands, never glancing toward the corners where gossip collected. She appeared to ignore the shifts in the king's attention. She greeted courtiers with the same serene expression, even when their eyes sparkled with rumors. Her restraint was a performance perfected through necessity. The appearance of indifference preserved her authority better than confrontation ever could. But her stillness did not mean she was blind. She watched the subtle patterns that emerged around her, the sudden stiffness in a servant's posture, the faint tremor in a maid's voice, the way a footman hesitated before delivering news. These small fractures in the palace's rhythm told her far more than any direct observation ever could. She saw without looking, understood without asking, and waited without revealing she was waiting. Her position demanded that she remain a figure of untouchable virtue, even as the ground beneath her shifted. She could not descend into the shadows where the king's mistress lived her precarious life. She had to remain distant, elevated, unreachable, and, in that unreachable space, she learned how to turn limitation into strategy, how to transform immobility into influence, and how to make silence speak for her when she could not speak for herself. Her restraint held the household in a delicate balance no one dared disturb. A deeper stillness gathered around her, carrying the faint suggestion of something shifting just beyond awareness. The moment that quiet begins to distort, another truth will press forward from the shadows. They moved with an ease that did not belong to them, yet was granted all the same, slipping through the chambers of the household like shadows given purpose. To the wife who lived under the weight of propriety, servants became the only eyes she was allowed to extend into places she herself could never step. They did not question this role, they grew into it, absorbing details that others overlooked, storing fragments of human behavior with the quiet precision of someone who knew that nothing, truly nothing, remained private for long. A servant never needed to stare to see. Their awareness lived in the corners of their vision, in the subtle shifts of posture they noticed while folding cloth or adjusting the position of a chair. They remembered the way a mistress lifted her chin a little too quickly, or how her hands trembled while fastening a ribbon that once sat more confidently. They noted when the queen's smile grew tighter, when her breath caught before speaking, when she studied her reflection with a hesitance that had not existed the week before. Each gesture was a thread. Servants learned to gather these threads until they formed something resembling truth. They were expected to blend into the background, to be as silent as tapestries and as forgettable as candle smoke. Yet their silence sharpened their senses. A single shift of weight, a pause too long before answering, a lowered gaze that tried too hard to appear neutral. Such moments stood out to them more clearly than spoken confessions. They remembered patterns with a kind of instinctual hunger, because to misread the atmosphere of the house was to expose themselves to danger. Their survival depended on interpreting others, and so they became better at it than anyone else within the palace walls. Such sensitivity allowed them to detect the slightest disturbances. A mistress who stopped humming during her morning routine, a queen who asked fewer questions than usual, a servant who lingered in the corridor before knocking, as though afraid of what waited behind the door. Nothing was too small to notice. A change in sleep patterns, a scent different from the night before, a gown worn more than once a week. They observed these things without appearing to notice them, their calm expressions hiding the meticulous catalogue of observations they carried. For the wife, this invisible attentiveness became a lifeline. Her dignity forbade her from stepping into the world of her rival. Yet she needed to understand it. She needed to sense the tremors before they reached her. Servants filled the space her status denied her. They did not report directly, not in the crude manner of spies, but in small, unintentional ways. A quiet hesitation when asked a simple question, a glance shared between two maids, a shift in tone when speaking about a particular corridor. Their bodies revealed what their words did not, and the wife who learned to read them discovered truths that no servant dared say aloud. Often, they conveyed information without meaning to. A laundress sorting garments might pause over a stain she did not recognize. A chambermaid smoothing sheets might hesitate, sensing an unfamiliar warmth lingering in the fabric. A footman carrying messages might stiffen slightly before delivering one, hinting at its contents without realizing he had done so. These small betrayals of awareness were never spoken of as accusations, yet they reached the wife with a clarity sharper than any formal report. Servants observed not only the people but the spaces between them. They understood when a room felt too still, when a hallway carried tension, when a door closed with a softness meant to conceal rather than to protect. Their knowledge came from proximity, repetition, and the relentless intimacy of tending to others' private lives. They witnessed the erosion of confidence long before nobles admitted anything was amiss. They saw fear take shape in the tightening of a jaw, or ambition flicker in the tilt of a chin. Their presence stitched the household together. Even when they stood silently in the corner, their awareness stretched beyond the boundaries of their tasks. They became the quiet bridge between rooms, the unnoticed recorders of unspoken shifts. The wife depended on this subtle vigilance, relying on the way servants remembered everything while pretending to remember nothing. Observing without appearing to observe was their craft. Understanding without being acknowledged was their burden. They were the quiet archivists of the palace's most fragile truths. Their stillness absorbed every tremor of the household. A deeper pattern always formed beneath what they carried. Once that pattern thickens, the walls begin to echo with meanings no one dares name. Nothing moved through the palace without brushing against the hands of those meant to remain unseen. Letters, gifts, whispered requests, hurried notes. Every fragment of private intention passed first through the fingers of servants. They carried these objects as though they were ordinary burdens. Yet each item pulsed with the weight of someone else's fear or desire. No noble truly understood how vulnerable their secrets became the moment they entrusted them to motion. Servants, however, understood perfectly. A letter never disappeared by accident. Before it was burned, delivered, or hidden, it existed briefly in the open, folded in trembling fingers, slipped beneath a cloak, tucked into the sleeve of a dress. Servants saw these moments with a quiet clarity. They recognized the urgency in a mistress's breath when she pressed a sealed note into the hands of a messenger. They saw the queen's stillness when she paused too long before writing her reply. They noticed when a courier hastened down a hallway, with his eyes downcast and his shoulders too stiff for someone carrying harmless correspondence. These observations were not the result of prying. They were consequences of proximity. A maid arranging the queen's bedclothes might find a letter hidden beneath the pillow. A footman delivering wine might catch sight of a folded parchment hastily concealed between books. A laundry worker could feel the faint imprint of a wax seal on a discarded scrap of cloth. Even without reading a single word, they could piece together intentions from the way nobles attempted to hide them. Gifts revealed even more. A ribbon scented with an unfamiliar perfume. A jewel wrapped too carefully for everyday wear. A handkerchief embroidered with initials that did not belong to the household. These items travelled through servant hands long before they reached their intended recipients. Servants examined their weight, their texture, their craftsmanship. Not from curiosity, but from habit. They learned the story of each object simply by handling it. And because they carried these gifts openly, while pretending to carry nothing unusual at all, they became the first witnesses to relationships that were meant to be concealed. Meetings were no different. Lovers who believed themselves discreet forgot that someone prepared the rooms they used. Servants cleaned the traces left behind, a misplaced hairpin, a smudged candle. A chair moved slightly out of rhythm with the rest of the room. They noticed when sheets bore the warmth of a body that should not have been there. They recognized the smell of agitation or anticipation lingering in the air. They observed that when a door was left barely ajar, despite having been closed earlier in the day, the palace imagined itself protected by walls, titles, and propriety. Yet nothing inside those walls escaped the reach of servants. They were the ones who ensured the household functioned, and in doing so, they stood at every crossroads where secrets had to pass. They unlocked doors, extinguished candles, prepared letters, carried packages, closed windows, lit hearths, and refurbished the spaces nobles inhabited. With every task, they brushed close to truths the court preferred to ignore. They also understood the fragility of secrecy. A noble might believe a hidden correspondence remained hidden because it stayed unread. But servants knew that concealment depended on silence, not ignorance. Silence was something they performed with practiced precision, smoothing their faces into expressions that revealed nothing of what they carried. They kept their breath steady, even when a letter crackled with tension. They walked calmly through corridors, even when they knew the object in their hands could alter the balance of the household. In the presence of nobles, they bowed, nodded, and stepped aside. But in the dim spaces behind doors, their awareness stretched far beyond the tasks assigned to them. They were not spies by choice, nor traitors by intention. They were simply present, always, at the precise moment when a secret changed hands. That presence granted them a kind of influence without authority, a power defined not by action, but by access. Every secret, no matter how carefully guarded, required movement. Without movement, it died. Servants were the ones who ensured that movement occurred. They were the veins through which the hidden life of the palace circulated, carrying not blood but information, not loyalty but truth, disguised as mundane duty. Every concealed intention brushed against them before reaching its destination. A deeper pulse always stirred when they sensed what others hoped to bury. When that pulse begins to shift, the quietest corridors will carry the tremor long before anyone dares to claim they felt it. Loyalty in a Tudor household was never a sentiment. It was a calculation shaped by need, fear, and dependency. A wife whose position looked secure from a distance understood better than anyone how fragile her foothold truly was. She could not choose her allies among nobles. Too ambitious, too entangled, too eager to shift allegiance the moment favor turned. Instead, she looked downward, toward the people who moved through her chambers with quiet diligence. Servants, unlike courtiers, could not afford disloyalty, and so she selected them with the precision of someone choosing the last defenses around her dignity. The first measure she sought was dependency. A servant with mouths to feed was far less likely to gamble with treachery. A maid whose children depended on her wages would not risk dismissal. A footman supporting aging parents could not afford a scandal. Their devotion did not arise from affection, but from the stark knowledge that losing her trust could mean losing their survival. The wife understood this instinctively. She had learned that fear bound people more tightly than admiration ever could. She also favored those who carried old debts, individuals whose lives had once brushed dangerously close to ruin, only to be steadied by her intervention. A laundress whose husband had fallen ill. A page boy was nearly dismissed after a minor mistake. A seamstress who had been slandered by another servant. When the wife stepped in to protect them, she did so quietly, with no expectation of repayment. But they remembered. Gratitude settled deep into them, forming a silent tether stronger than any oath they could speak aloud. They served her with a loyalty sharpened by memory. Beyond dependency and gratitude, she chose servants who possessed something to lose. Those with small inheritances, arranged marriages, or long-standing family ties understood that treachery would not only cost them their positions, but stain their lineage. A single accusation could shadow generations. People like these handled secrets with care, not from virtue, but from the instinct to preserve everything they had built. Their lives were rooted, their risks were vast. This made them reliable observers, steady carriers of information, and unlikely conduits for betrayal. The queen or noble wife studied them quietly before making her choices. She watched how they carried themselves when they believed no one paid attention. A servant who moved with unnecessary confidence drew suspicion. One who appeared timid could crumble under pressure. What she sought was steadiness. A servant who completed tasks without haste, who listened more than they spoke, whose presence softened rather than disturbed the atmosphere. These were the ones who could slip unnoticed into the fabric of the palace, gathering truths without appearing to gather anything at all. Sometimes, her selection hinged on silence. A servant who responded quickly and calmly when confronted with discomfort revealed a rare kind of inner discipline. One who allowed rumors to pass without adding to them displayed an instinct for self-preservation. She valued restraint as much as skill. Servants who mastered the art of withholding were far more useful to her than those who knew how to speak. Once chosen, these servants became extensions of her awareness. They moved through the household with an attentiveness shaped not by ambition, but by duty. They brushed past conversations with lowered eyes, yet collected every tremor in a voice. They observed glances exchanged across hallways. They noted when someone lingered too long near the king's chamber. Their observations were rarely conveyed in words. Instead, they travelled through small hesitations, altered postures, or fleeting expressions that told the wife more than a report ever could. This network of loyalty did not resemble espionage. It resembled breath, quiet, constant, unnoticed unless disturbed. The wife relied on it not for dramatic revelations, but for the subtle shifts that signaled pressure beneath the palace's polished surface. She knew that a single detail, observed at the right moment, could spare her from humiliation or alert her to danger. Her chosen servants understood the weight of what they guarded. They recognized that the wife's composure depended on their steadiness. They protected her reputation with the quiet solidarity of people who knew she could be toppled not by scandal itself, but by learning of it too late. In this way, loyalty became a shared burden, unspoken but absolute. Her choices bound them all in a delicate circle of necessity. A quiet tension formed whenever those bonds tightened. Should that circle shift even slightly, the truths held within it will begin to slide toward places no one intended. Listening was the softest form of intrusion, yet in the Tudor household it became the most potent. Servants learned early that their presence dissolved the moment nobles grew comfortable. A mistress might pour out her anxieties while having her hair brushed. A queen might confess her doubts while being laced into a gown. Words spoken in these moments were not meant for anyone beyond the room, yet they spilled into the open with a casual vulnerability that revealed more than any formal conversation. Servants stood behind them with calm hands and lowered eyes, absorbing every tremor in their voices. They mastered the art of existing just outside the boundary of notice. A maid fastening sleeves or smoothing a collar appeared wholly focused on her task. Yet her ears caught the fragments nobles believed were private. Snatches of names, half-finished sentences, the quiver of a whispered plea. These settled quietly into memory. Servants never needed to lean closer. Proximity alone was enough. The intimacy of dressing and grooming required them to stand near the pulse of another person's life. Where secrets surfaced unguarded, they also became sensitive to tone, rhythm, and breath. A mistress who repeated a name too often betrayed longing or fear. A queen whose voice tightened during certain hours suggested the timing of her unease. Even silence carried meaning, the kind that followed unexpected news, or the kind that settled after an unspoken thought. Servants learned to interpret these silences with the same precision nobles applied to politics. What was not said often revealed more than what was spoken. Remembering became their second craft. They kept no written records. Writing risked exposure. And servants understood that betrayal often came from what could be found, rather than what was known. Instead, they built mental archives, sorting details into patterns. A name mentioned once might be forgotten, but a name repeated across days gains weight. A visit occurring at the same hour each week became a signal. A sudden change in someone's routine. A missing ribbon. An extra candle burned low. A door left ajar. Became a clue. These patterns formed quietly in their minds. Servants did not speak them aloud. Not even among themselves. They simply knew. They remembered who passed through which corridor, how long they stayed, when they returned, and whether their footsteps carried anxiety or anticipation. Time became a language they understood intimately. By listening and remembering, they could predict shifts in the household before anyone else sensed them. The Queen relied on this unspoken vigilance. She could not ask questions openly, but she observed the slight stiffness in a servant's posture when she mentioned a particular name. She noticed how a maid's eyes flickered when asked about an evening's events. Servants communicated through hesitation, through gestures, through the faint tremor of breath that betrayed knowledge they dared not voice. Their memories became an extension of her intuition, guiding her through conflicts she could never witness directly. Eavesdropping never required intention. It occurred naturally in spaces where nobles exposed their vulnerabilities without realizing how many ears surrounded them. Dressing rooms, corridors, and antechambers became the true centers of intelligence, not because they held political documents, but because they held unguarded human truth. Servants understood this deeply. Their listening was not an act of aggression. It was an inevitable consequence of occupying the spaces where nobility let their masks slip. Names carried power in these whispered moments. A servant, hearing a name repeated too softly, knew it belonged to someone the mistress wished to hide. A name spoken with bitterness revealed a threat. A name left unspoken, replaced by silence or averted eyes, revealed fear. Servants filed these nuances into the growing map of the household's internal tensions. Time strengthened their understanding. They remembered not only what was said, but when it was said. Words spoken at dawn carried a different meaning than those whispered at midnight. A sudden change in frequency. Someone who stopped speaking of a particular person, or someone who began mentioning them too often, signaled a shift. Servants traced these rhythms instinctively, assembling a quiet knowledge that nobles would have dismissed as beneath their notice. They never boasted of this skill. They never confided in one another. Listening was simply woven into their existence, an unspoken expectation shaped by survival. What they heard shaped the undercurrent of the palace more profoundly than any official decree. Secrets flourished in the spaces where servants listened, and servants became the silent gardeners tending them. Their memories held the household together more tightly than any vow. A subtle tension always rose when these recollections aligned too neatly. If those gathered fragments begin to converge, something concealed will edge dangerously close to revelation. Objects rarely travelled cleanly through a Tudor household. Every letter, every trinket, every carefully wrapped parcel passed through hands that did not belong to the sender or the intended recipient. Servants became the silent intermediaries, the ones who transformed every physical exchange into something uncertain. They held the flow of material information with a quiet authority no noble wished to acknowledge. What they touched could vanish, slow, reappear altered, or carry traces of knowledge the owners never meant to share. A letter sealed in haste might linger a little too long in a servant's pocket before reaching its destination. The delay could be as subtle as an hour or as damning as a full day. Yet the meaning behind that delay mattered more than the time itself. A queen waiting for news would feel her pulse tighten. A mistress expecting a secret message would grow restless. Servants understood this unease intimately, sensing the tension that settled when correspondence arrived out of rhythm. They did not need to break the seal, the weight of the letter, the smell of the wax, and the tremor in the sender's hands told them everything they needed to know. Sometimes, the letter simply never arrived. It became ash in a hearth, swept away with morning cinders, or it slipped behind furniture during cleaning and was forgotten conveniently. Servants chose such moments with a stillness that resembled instinct more than calculation. They recognized when a message carried danger to their mistress, or when delivering it might worsen the storm, gathering quietly behind the palace's polished veneer. They intervened without leaving evidence, allowing the absence itself to speak. Gifts were even more revealing. The smallest token, a ribbon, a brooch, a vial of perfume, passed through hands that studied its texture, its craftsmanship, and its intent. Servants could tell whether a gift was chosen with affection, desperation, or warning. They could sense when a mistress received something too precious for her station, or when a queen accepted a present with forced serenity. These items travelled through the household like small sparks, their heat noticed first by the people tasked with carrying them. Sometimes, gifts were exchanged for safer equivalents. A ribbon carrying the scent of another woman became a plain strip of fabric. A letter pressed into a small box was replaced with an innocuous keepsake. A jewel that suggested impropriety was quietly redirected into a drawer the wife would find later, its meaning reshaped by context. Servants altered the path of objects with the kind of composure that made their actions nearly invisible. To them, this was not manipulation, it was maintenance. The preservation of a fragile balance that nobles disrupted without realizing it. Objects carried stories, and servants knew how to read those stories from their surfaces. A gown with a torn seam revealed hurried movements. A handkerchief smudged with unfamiliar perfume hinted at an encounter meant to stay hidden. A dagger missing from its place suggested a night of fear. These items often reached the servants first. During cleaning, sorting, or preparation, they examined them with practiced neutrality, recognizing the significance of the smallest marks. Physical evidence could shift the trajectory of entire lives. Servants did not wield this evidence openly. They allowed it to settle in the shadows, informing their decisions without exposing their involvement. A maid who found a letter half-burned might adjust her behavior toward the queen. A footman who noticed a bruise beneath a mistress's sleeve might watch the king with new caution. Their awareness shaped the quiet undercurrent of the household. Guiding choices that nobles never realized depended on such delicate observations. The material world of the palace passed entirely through their hands. They sorted, carried, cleaned, delivered, replaced, and destroyed with the calm efficiency expected of them. But behind that efficiency was an intelligence, sharpened by proximity to the objects nobles attempted to hide. Servants learned to interpret the physical remnants of someone's life more accurately than any spoken confession. A household's tensions, desires, betrayals, and fears all revealed themselves, not through dramatic confrontations, but through the silent drift of objects handled daily. Their control was not direct. It was atmospheric. They shaped the flow of information without appearing to shape anything at all. Slowed letters, altered gifts, preserved evidence. Each action stitched itself into the palace's fragile structure, shifting outcomes while leaving no fingerprints behind. To outsiders, the household seemed to function smoothly. Only the servants felt the weight of what they touched. The quiet movement of objects became the hidden pulse of the household. A faint pressure always gathered when too many items carried stories they were not meant to hold. Should that pressure deepen, the smallest misplaced token may unravel far more than anyone intended. She walked through the palace with the confidence of someone who believed danger announced itself. A mistress, accustomed to secrecy yet sheltered by affection, often imagined that threat would appear in a pair of hostile eyes, a sharp word, or a confrontation too public to ignore. But in Tudor halls, danger rarely approached so directly. It lingered instead in quiet corners, settling into the breath of those who watched without raising their gaze. She sensed whispers. Yes, but she dismissed them as the ordinary turbulence of court life. What she did not sense were the eyes that never sought her face, the presence that never asked her name, and the silence that collected behind her like dust. She believed herself unseen only when she chose to be, slipping between doors with practiced subtlety, adjusting her step so that her movements blended with the household's rhythm. Yet servants tracked that rhythm more faithfully than she did. They felt the shift in the air when she passed. They noticed when she paused to steady her breath near the king's chamber. They recognized the tension in her hands when she lifted her skirts to ascend the stairs. Nothing about her remained unmarked, even if she never saw the people who carried these impressions quietly within them. There were no direct stares to warn her, no lingering glances from the queen's attendants, no sharpened expressions from the palace guard. Everyone around her maintained the same neutral composure demanded by etiquette, a courtesy that functioned like a veil. She interpreted this politeness as indifference. She mistook silence for safety. Had someone confronted her openly, she might have understood the scale of what surrounded her. Instead, she moved through the palace, believing the walls protected her, unaware that those same walls stored the echoes of her footsteps, her sighs, and her smallest acts of hesitation. She could not feel the network tightening around her, subtle as breathing, patient as dusk. Servants communicated not through words, but through the soft transfer of awareness from one task to another. A maid smoothing the sheets noticed the faint warmth left by the mistress's presence and carried that knowledge in her posture. A footman opening a door felt the lingering tremor in the handle, a sign of someone who had grasped it with urgency. A laundress recognized a scent out of place. None of them spoke, yet all of them understood. To the mistress, the house felt obedient, predictable. Hallways opened when she approached. Rooms accommodated her quietly. Servants bowed, stepped aside, and cleared her path as though nothing in the world could pierce the illusion she inhabited. But behind that smooth choreography was a watchfulness she could not sense. The queen's awareness did not reach her through her eyes. It reached her through absence, through the way. Certain doors stayed closed longer than expected, through the subtle delay of a message she anticipated, through the tightening quiet that settled after she left a room. She interpreted these moments as an inconvenience, not a warning. She imagined the household too large, too busy, to track someone like her. She believed the queen was too dignified to concern herself with petty details. Such assumptions gave her a dangerous sense of invisibility. She thought herself unnoticed because no one stopped her. In truth, no one stopped her because they already knew where she would go. There was no confrontation, no whispers in her presence, no signs dramatic enough to force recognition. The palace preserved appearances with the same devotion it preserved its tapestries. Everyone played their role with care. Even the walls seemed loyal to the pretense, reflecting nothing but the flicker of candles and the soft hem of her gown. Yet in their stillness, they carried the impressions of those who had passed before. A mistress who listened closely, truly listened, might have felt the tension humming beneath the polished surface, but she heard only her own hope, her own fear, her own fragile confidence. She mistook this quiet for protection. She did not understand that in Tudor life, the absence of opposition was often the prelude to collapse. No one looked at her long enough to betray suspicion. No one confronted her sharply enough to spark panic. She moved freely because every watcher had already stepped into place, observing her through the smallest anomalies. The missing ribbon she left behind, the candle she extinguished too quickly, the servant who walked past her twice with averted eyes. Her ignorance was not foolishness. It was the natural consequence of living in a palace where power disguised itself as courtesy. The queen would never degrade herself by tailing her rival. Servants would never break decorum by staring openly, and the mistress would never realize that her every breath had been measured long before she understood she was being watched. Her steps left no mark she could see, yet the house gathered each one like a quiet ledger. A deeper stillness always formed when those observations aligned. When that stillness thickens, the illusion of safety surrounding her will begin to thin in ways she cannot ignore. The bedroom, more than any council chamber or banquet hall, held the truth of a Tudor household. It was the one place where masks slipped, not through confession, but through patterns. A bedchamber revealed loyalties, hopes, and deceptions with a clarity no witness could deny. Servants understood this better than anyone. They studied the way doors opened and closed, the hours at which footsteps approached, and the rhythm of movements inside the room. What nobles hid with words, the bedchamber exposed through routine. Entry and exit formed the first language of this space. A knock too soft signaled caution. A door pushed open without hesitation suggested entitlement. Servants memorized who came and who left, noting the subtle urgency in their movements. A man leaving too early in the morning betrayed the weight of his unease. A woman lingering too long outside the threshold hinted at fear or longing. These were not dramatic moments. They were small fractures in behavior that servants absorbed automatically. Even the sound of footsteps told a story. Measured for confidence, scattered for guilt, softened for secrecy. The bedroom also kept time with unusual precision. Servants knew when the king visited, how long he stayed, and how often he returned. They did not need to observe directly. The shift in air, the sound of fabric brushing stone, the faint creak of a floorboard told them everything. A visit that lasted an hour suggested duty. A visit that lingered deep into the night revealed affection or unrest. A sudden absence over several days hinted at danger. By tracking these durations, servants mapped the emotional tides of the household without ever speaking a word. The mistress believed the bedroom concealed her most intimate moments. But the truth was harsher. Servants heard when her breath was unsteady, when she paced the floor before dawn, when she sat motionless too long beside a dying candle. They recognized when she slept restlessly, her sheets tangled with fear. They noticed when she rose earlier than usual, pretending calm while her hands betrayed her trembling. Every deviation etched itself into the quiet intelligence of those who tended the chamber. What made the bedroom undeniable was its order. Traces remained on every surface. A bed was left slightly uneven, a pillow holding the warmth of two bodies instead of one. A discarded pair of shoes was misaligned in a way that contradicted the mistress's habits. Servants who changed linens each morning learned to read these subtleties. They touched the fabric and felt what had unfolded hours earlier. They sensed arguments from the violent pull of a bed cover. They sensed longing from the carefully folded garments, set aside with trembling care. Even objects whispered. A candle reduced further than expected suggested the mistress waited long into the night. A mirror smudged by nervous fingers suggested she rehearsed the courage she lacked. A cup left untouched suggested she had no appetite for sleep or for calm. Servants noticed these signs with the quiet patience of people accustomed to studying disorder. The bedroom never lied to them. It revealed what its occupant wished no one to see. The Queen's attendants, too, watched the bedchamber from a distance. They tracked when the mistress's door stayed closed longer than usual. They sensed irregularities in the household's rhythm. They communicated nothing openly. Yet their collective stillness formed a subtle warning. The Queen relied on these quiet signals, understanding that a single deviation could shift her standing. She measured her rival's influence not by rumour, but by the timing of the king's absence from her own rooms. In a palace built on ceremony, it was the private spaces that shaped the future. The bedchamber absorbed secrets with an indifference almost cruel. It did not choose sides. It simply stored evidence until someone capable of interpreting it passed through. Servants became those interpreters, collecting countless impressions while performing mundane tasks. Their observations flowed invisibly into the household's bloodstream, feeding the queen's intuition and tightening the invisible net around the mistress. The mistress never understood how exposed she truly was. She believed the closed door protected her. That darkness shielded her. That silence preserved her dignity. Instead, every quiet moment became another line recorded in the memory of those who moved through her room after she left. The bedchamber held her story long before she realized she was writing it. The room held every trace with a patience that never faltered. A deeper pressure gathered each time. Its quiet rhythm shifted in ways too subtle for the mistress to sense. As that pressure thickens, the truths sealed inside its walls may begin to slip into the open on their own. Female servants held a vantage point no one else in the Tudor household possessed. They approached the mistress not as rivals, not as courtiers, not as silent observers along the walls, but as hands required to touch her directly, in proximity that dissolved every boundary of rank. They dressed her, bathed her, tightened her laces, brushed her hair, and lifted the fabrics that concealed her body from the world. The intimacy of these moments granted them access to truths spoken not through words but through skin, fabric, breath, and trembling. A mistress rarely realized how exposed she was in these small routines. She imagined the maid's eyes lowered, the gestures automatic, the silence respectful. Yet female servants saw everything. They noticed the faint bruises along her ribs when she raised her arms. They saw the redness at her neck, where a necklace had been grasped too roughly. They observed the uneven tone of her skin when sleep had eluded her, and the tension that tightened her shoulders when she tried to appear calm. Nothing about her body escaped their quiet recording. Marks told stories more honestly than confessions. A fading bruise revealed a night she wished forgotten. A torn seam in her undergarments hinted at rushed movements or hurried fear. A loose thread along the hem of her gown indicated a secret meeting that required stealth. Servants did not need to interpret these signs in full. The patterns themselves aligned with the rhythm of the household. They connected details the mistress believed invisible and recognized the shifts in her life long before she spoke of them. A maid brushing her hair could tell if she had cried the night before. The slight stiffness near the scalp, the dryness along the temples, the fragile way she breathed when the brush tugged. These were things only women working closely with her could sense. They felt the weight she carried even when her posture remained perfect. They understood the vulnerability beneath her carefully arranged poise. Clothing revealed just as much as skin. Fabrics that should have fallen smoothly clung with unusual tension. Ribbons, usually tied with precision, appeared twisted from unsteady fingers. The lingering scent of someone else's chambers settled into the mistress's sleeves. These details whispered their own language, and the servants who handled her garments each day became fluent in its subtle grammar. They lifted each piece of clothing with a quiet awareness that went far beyond their assigned duties. They also witnessed what was absent, what the mistress attempted to hide. A missing brooch she claimed to have misplaced. A loosened stay, she insisted, was merely old. A small cut on her hand, she explained, with a laugh that did not reach her eyes. Female servants learned to read the spaces around these explanations. Sensing the unspoken tension that shaped them, they understood when a mistress feared judgment, when she feared discovery, and when she feared the consequences of her own choices. Despite seeing all this, they did not confront her. Their silence formed part of the structure of palace life. They were expected to absorb, not question, but silence did not equate to ignorance. Each detail they gathered flowed through the invisible channels that connected the Queen's network. A maid loyal to the Queen carried the truth in her posture long before speaking a word. A gesture shared with another servant, a tightened jaw, a shift of gaze, signaled changes that mattered. The Queen did not need to invade the mistress's private space herself. Her servants entered that space daily. The female servant's knowledge did not grow through malice. It grew through repetition, through routine. through the quiet understanding that bodies rarely lie. They learned the mistress's patterns so thoroughly that any deviation became a quiet alarm. If she rose earlier than usual, they knew. If she dressed with unusual care, they sensed why. If she trembled while fastening a sleeve, they recognized the origin of her fear, even without seeing the event that caused it. This depth of awareness gave them a kind of authority the mistress never acknowledged. They held her secrets before she knew she had revealed them. They carried her vulnerabilities without needing to touch them directly. They became the living record of her life, a record she never meant to create. In the stillness of the dressing chamber, where light fell softly across fabric and skin, the truth existed in every motion. Servants observed this truth quietly, allowing it to settle within them like dust on polished wood. They were the first to witness change, the first to sense danger, and the first to gather evidence without lifting a single page or listening at a single door. Their hands shaped her appearance, yet they held far more than fabric. A slow, gathering tension deepened whenever her body revealed truths she tried to conceal. Should that tension tighten further, even the softest gesture may begin to expose what she believed safely hidden. Male servants operated in a different current of the Tudor household, one that moved through corridors, guard posts, stables, and council antechambers. They did not touch the mistress's body or dress her hair. Yet they accessed something just as revealing, the conversations and patterns that shaped the king's movements. While female servants collected the intimate details of private life, male servants gathered the wider echoes that drifted through the palace. They became the quiet link between what happened inside closed chambers and what unfolded beyond them. They listened, not through deliberate spying, but through the constant motion their duties required. A guard speaking too casually at his post revealed more than he intended. A secretary handing off documents muttered names, dates, and concerns without noticing who stood nearby. A messenger arriving breathless from another wing of the palace carried information in his urgency alone. Male servants absorbed these fragments naturally, their minds adapting to the rhythm of overheard voices. They understood the king's schedule better than many nobles. They knew when he preferred solitude and when he welcomed company. They recognized the nights he returned later than usual, the mornings he rose too early, and the days when tension tightened the air before he even appeared. This awareness came not from direct instruction, but from the shifting patterns of the palace itself. A sudden flurry of movement in the guardroom, a whispered exchange between officers, a servant carrying candles toward rooms usually kept dark. These signs formed a map of intention long before the king spoke a word. The mistress rarely imagined that male servants monitored the king this way. She assumed the king's movements remained private, or at least shielded by masculine loyalty. But loyalty in a Tudor household flowed in many directions, and the queen's influence extended discreetly into the spaces where men worked. A footman who carried wine to the king might catch the scent of another woman on his cloak. A stable hand who prepared the king's horse late at night noticed when he returned smelling of a different chamber. These observations moved quietly between servants, stitched together into a picture far clearer than the mistress suspected. What made this network effective was its lack of structure. No one issued orders. No one declared allegiance openly. Male servants simply passed each other in hallways, exchanged glances, adjusted their pace, or shifted their posture slightly. Small signals that conveyed shifts in knowledge. A servant brushing past another with tightened shoulders suggested urgency. A guard who avoided eye contact hinted at something overheard near the council rooms. These gestures accumulated into a silent archive. Because they operated outside the dressing chambers and private domestic spaces, male servants connected internal details to external consequences. They might hear a diplomat mention rumors about the king's favoritism. They might learn that a supply of rare silk was being prepared for a woman who was not the queen. They might notice the king ordering musicians to a private room, despite no scheduled gathering. These fragments, insignificant on their own, merged into something sharper when compared with what female servants observed. Slowly, the network formed a complete picture, one that the mistress could never imagine existed. She believed her secrets lived within the walls of her chamber. But male servants tracked the approach of consequences from outside. They sensed the queen's rising tension through the guarded conversations of her attendants. They recognized when the king grew impatient, when he grew careless, or when he grew afraid. They knew when rumors spread through the guard posts, murmurs too consistent to dismiss. Their power lay not in acting, but in linking. Each servant held a fragment of the truth. Together, they created a quiet constellation of knowledge. The queen did not need to ask for reports. Her servants simply existed in the correct spaces, absorbing details and carrying them with the stillness of people who understood the cost of misinterpretation. When one servant's knowledge intersected with another's, the pattern crystallized without a single spoken command. The mistress never heard these echoes. She focused on her private world, her visits, her letters, the rhythms of her own chamber. She did not realize that men moving through outer corridors already sensed the tremors her life produced. They watched the guards shift positions. They noticed courtiers whispering with tightened expressions. They felt the atmosphere gather weight around the queen's household. By the time the mistress suspected any danger, the network outside her rooms had already traced its outline. Male servants did not confront her. They did not watch her directly. Their knowledge grew outward then inward, tightening like a ring around the household. They were the ones who knew when the queen prepared to move, when the king hesitated, and when the palace itself braced for change. They became the bridge between the personal and the political, linking scattered evidence into a quiet force. Their movements threaded the palace with a knowledge the mistress never sensed. A subtle shift always formed whenever scattered whispers began to align. Once that shift gathers weight, the world outside her chamber will begin to close in long before she understands what surrounds her. Rumors in a Tudor household did not begin as inventions. They began as small truths. Quiet, incomplete, fragile enough to bend, but too real to ignore. Servants carried these truths like grains of dust on their sleeves, letting them drift through corridors until they settled where they were meant to take root. A rumor did not need to be loud, or clever, or carefully constructed. It only needed to be timed. And timing, in a palace governed by mood and proximity, was a weapon sharper than any blade. A maid who overheard the mistress crying at dawn did not speak of the tears directly. She mentioned instead that the mistress rose earlier than usual, her voice shifting just enough to suggest the weight behind the observation. A footman who noticed the king leaving a chamber late at night did not recount the hour in detail. He said only that the guards had been slower to change shifts. These fragments, released with careful restraint, drifted into the spaces where worry already lived. Rumors did not need to accuse. They merely nudged. No servant dared lie outright. Falsehoods exposed the speaker and shattered the delicate balance of the household. Instead, they leaned on truths too small to provoke confrontation, but potent enough to alter perception. A faint perfume lingering where it should not linger. A misplaced ribbon appeared in a room it was not meant to be in. A hesitation in the king's step after leaving the mistress's chamber. These truths existed openly, yet they meant nothing until servants placed them gently into waiting ears. What made the humor powerful was not its content but its direction. Servants did not scatter whispers randomly. They guided them toward the queen's attendants, the women who understood how to listen without looking surprised. A single comment made while folding linens could travel through 3 households by evening, shedding its blunt edges and gaining implication. The queen never asked for details. She had learned long ago that information spoken freely carried more honesty than reports summoned by command. This deliberate slow feeding of knowledge created the illusion that conclusions formed naturally. A lady-in-waiting who heard that the mistress skipped a meal recalled, without prompting, that the king had missed council hours the same morning. Another servant, dusting the queen's chambers, mentioned in passing that the mistress had sent for new gowns earlier than expected. The pieces clicked together without anyone stating the obvious. That was the elegance of controlled rumour. Its power came from silence, or not accusation. Meanwhile, the mistress felt only a faint shift in the household's air. Servants curtsied as they always did. Doors opened at her approach. The palace maintained its practiced neutrality. Yet something delicate changed. Footsteps that once passed without pause now lingered slightly at corners. Conversations hushed mid-sentence when she entered a room. She could not grasp the pattern, but she sensed a softness in the walls turning rigid. Rumour pressed forward, not as sound but as atmosphere. For the servants, the work was nearly invisible. A word spoken too early could misfire. A word spoken too late could be useless. They waited for tension to rise naturally. An argument behind closed doors. A misplaced letter. A visit from the king that lasted too long. When the moment arrived, they released their fragments into the air like embers drifting from a quiet fire. The embers caught because the palace was built of dry material. Suspicion, pride, ambition, fear. Rumours grew not by exaggeration but by repetition. A single observation, heard from 3 different mouths, felt like the truth, even if no one had added new details. The Queen understood this rhythm intuitively. She watched the shifting behaviour of those around her with the calm of someone accustomed to reading what remained unspoken. She acted only after rumour matured into a shape she could trust, letting the palace's quiet machinery prepare the ground before she made her move. The mistress, meanwhile, remained unaware that she had become a silhouette outlined by whispers. Nothing touched her directly. No accusation confronted her. Yet the floor beneath her began to thin. Servants glanced at her with a softness that felt almost sympathetic. An omen more dangerous than hostility. She sensed an approaching change she could not name. A tightening of unseen threads. Rumours did not destroy her in a single blow. They hollowed the structure around her, dissolving the confidence others once placed in her presence. By the time she recognized the shift, the Queen already held the advantage, supported by a network that needed no proof. Only the quiet certainty that too many small truths could not be dismissed. Rumour moved like a calm breath through stone corridors, shaping judgment without raising its voice. A stillness deepened each time another small truth joined its path. As that stillness grows unmistakable, even the softest whisper may tip the balance. No one admits to watching. Information rarely arrived before the Queen with drama. It approached her the way mist gathers over quiet water. Slow, unhurried, nearly shapeless at first. Nothing was ever presented as an accusation. No one dared to whisper anything that could be traced back to a single tongue. Instead, the Queen received a pattern, one detail at a time, repeated gently enough to feel natural, yet persistent enough to carve a line through her thoughts. Servants understood that the Queen did not need certainty. She needed repetition, rhythm, and the subtle alignment of many small truths. A maid might mention, in an entirely neutral tone, that the mistress had risen late that morning. A few hours later, another servant, pretending to speak of laundry, would note that the mistress had sent out more garments than usual. Someone else, perhaps while arranging flowers, he would comment that fresh perfume lingered faintly in her corridor. None of these statements meant anything alone. Together, they formed a quiet pressure. The Queen did not react outwardly. Her face remained composed, her breath steady. Yet the servants could sense when a detail landed, a slight pause in her hands, the brief stilling of her gaze, the measured silence before she resumed her task. These reactions were small enough to miss, but the servants trained themselves to observe them. They knew when information had reached its intended depth. No servant ever said, "The mistress is hiding something." They did not need to. They simply repeated what they knew the queen would recognize as out of rhythm. The mistress declined food. She lingered near certain halls. She received gifts requiring explanation. The queen accumulated these facts without demanding more. She let them settle into her understanding the way dust settles on stone, quietly, steadily, without disturbance. The repetition was never excessive, too much, and it would reveal intention, too little, and it would lose force. Servants paced their contributions carefully. A single observation left untouched for days grew stronger in the queen's mind than one spoken repeatedly. She learned to measure its weight not by volume, but by persistence, information that returned to her again and again, through different mouths and different moments, possessed a truth of its own. In these exchanges, silence mattered more than speech. Servants paused at the right time, allowing the queen's thoughts to drift toward the implication without needing to hear it aloud. They left room for her to draw her own conclusions, which made those conclusions feel inevitable. The queen trusted what she deduced more deeply than anything stated directly. It gave her control, or at least the impression of it. Meanwhile, the mistress remained unaware of how thoroughly her behavior was being charted. She believed herself careful. She believed the palace indifferent. She did not realize that each small irregularity, her altered sleep, her new anxieties, her shifting routines, moved quietly from one servant to another until it reached the queen in a softened, polished form. She never imagined that her life had been divided into segments. Each one carried separately and recombined only at the queen's side. When the queen finally recognized a pattern, she did not respond abruptly. She let the understanding settle first, allowing herself to see the shape of the truth without forcing it. She observed those around her, attendants who avoided her eyes, guards who stood more tensely near the mistress's quarters, servants who carried a subtle heaviness in their movements. She watched, not for the mistake itself, but for the rhythm of the palace, shifting around it. The queen rarely confronted the mistress immediately. Confrontation risked exposing the network that fed her. Instead, she allowed information to sharpen her intuition. Her silence became her weapon. Servants sensed when her posture changed, when her presence grew stiller, when her attention lingered longer on the doorways the mistress used. The queen positioned herself with the calm certainty of someone who had gathered enough fragments to form a quiet verdict. By the time the queen chose to act, the mistress already stood on fragile ground. Though she did not know it yet, information had built a slow, deliberate foundation beneath the queen's feet. There was no need for evidence or confession. The accumulation of repeated details had formed its own gravity, pulling the queen toward a truth she could no longer ignore. In Tudor life, certainty did not come from revelation. It came from the quiet alignment of small, persistent truths. Servants understood this better than anyone, and they shaped the queen's understanding with the same care a tailor used to shape a gown. Measured, patient, precisi. Each repeated detail settled around the queen, like threads woven into a single fabric. A deeper clarity formed whenever those threads tightened into a pattern she could no longer dismiss. Once that clarity becomes undeniable, the stillness surrounding her will begin to shift in ways the mistress cannot anticipate. A Tudor wife learned early that survival did not depend on force, volume, or confrontation. It depended on timing. She understood that reacting too soon risked appearing jealous, insecure, or desperate, qualities the court would seize upon with quiet cruelty. So she mastered restraint. Her silence, far from passive, became a chamber where thoughts cooled into strategy. Servants who approached her during these moments sensed the weight in the air, a stillness sharpened by calculation rather than uncertainty. She never rushed toward judgment. Instead, she let the fragments of information gather, watching how they settled around her like dust on polished wood. Each detail, repeated by servants, echoed in shifting routines, embedded in the palace's rhythm, woven together to form a contour she trusted more than any spoken accusation. She understood that truth revealed itself gradually, through patterns rather than proclamations. Her stillness was not hesitation. It was refinement. Silence served another purpose. It unsettled those who watched her. Courtiers accustomed to loud disputes and dramatic gestures found themselves disoriented by her quiet. They tried to read her expression, but her composure held firm. Even the king, who expected outbursts or interrogation, saw no immediate shift in her behavior. Her hands poured wine with the same steadiness. Her footsteps crossed the chamber with the same measured grace. Yet the absence of reaction created its own tremor. People feared what they could not predict. The queen understood that every household, especially one ruled by a king prone to desire, was a stage where patience could be mistaken for weakness. She allowed that misunderstanding to breathe. It shielded her intentions. Servants, however, recognized the truth. Her silence was a reservoir accumulating strength, not draining it. They saw how she listened without appearing to listen, how she watched without raising suspicion, how she positioned herself exactly where she needed to be to gather the final pieces. When she finally chose to act, she did not do so on impulse. She waited for the moment when the king's attention began to waver, or when the mistress grew careless under the illusion of safety. She waited until rumor thickened into near certainty and the palace's subtle currents aligned. The shift came like the tightening of a thread, barely perceptible, yet strong enough to guide her next move. She never sought total proof. Tudor life rarely offered such luxuries. She sought a configuration of signs that made inaction more dangerous than action. Her actions themselves were rarely loud. She did not storm chambers or confront rivals with raised voices. Instead, she adjusted the palace's machinery with precise, nearly invisible pressure. A guard was reassigned. A door was locked earlier than usual. A servant was instructed to delay a message by an hour. These alterations, small enough to escape the king's notice, large enough to unbalance the mistress, created a slow erosion around her rival's foundation. Sometimes the queen acted through absence rather than presence. She withdrew gestures of favour, withheld invitations, and allowed certain conversations to continue without interruption. These choices reshaped the atmosphere more effectively than accusation. They encouraged the court to reconsider alliances. They hinted at instability around the mistress, a dangerous scent in a world ruled by appearances. What made her power formidable was her refusal to be rushed. She allowed consequences to gather momentum naturally. She knew that pressure applied too early, scattered. But pressure allowed to ripen carried its own force. She understood that a mistress often destroyed herself in the end. Not through wickedness, but through fear. A frightened woman made mistakes, revealed desperation, and exposed vulnerabilities. The queen simply positioned herself where those cracks became undeniable. Even the king felt her silence. He sensed the shift, though he could not name it. He felt her gaze linger just a moment longer on his hands, his clothes, his movements. He felt the weight of her stillness at supper, the precision of her greetings, the slight quiet surrounding her attendants. None of it accused him, yet all of it pressed gently against his conscience. Her restraint forced him to consider what she already knew, creating a discomfort more effective than anger. The mistress rarely understood how the queen's decision took shape. She only felt the space around her tighten, the invitations that never arrived, the servants who became watchful, the king whose warmth grew inconsistent. She sensed a shift, but could not find its source. She waited for confrontation, not realizing that the queen would never grant her such clarity. Action had already begun, but it echoed through silence, not confrontation. In Tudor life, the queen's greatest weapon was her ability to choose when to move. She waited until every detail aligned, until the household itself seemed to lean toward her decision. When she stepped forward, she stepped onto ground already prepared by quiet observation and patient gathering of truth. Her silence shaped the air long before her choice took form. A deeper firmness entered her presence each time another quiet detail settled into place. The moment that firmness turns into intent, the balance around her will begin to shift with a weight the mistress cannot escape. A mistress in a Tudor palace often believed that danger would come from sharp words, hostile glances, or open rivalry. She rarely imagined it could arrive through her breakfast, her wardrobe, or the slow rearrangement of her daily routine. Yet this was where the Queen's influence moved with the greatest precision. Servants, quiet, dutiful, unremarkable, became the instruments through which the Queen pressed gently on the mistress's life until the smallest tasks grew heavy. Nothing needed to be said. Nothing needed to be threatened. Control entered her world through the quiet erosion of ordinary comforts. The first changes were subtle. A meal arrived later than usual. Not late enough to offend, but late enough to unsettle her hunger. Bread grew slightly stale. Fruit slightly bruised. Broth slightly thin. The servants apologized with lowered eyes, blaming the kitchen or the garden, or the inconsistent supply from the market. She accepted these excuses at first, unaware that her appetite was being guided into unease. Meals shaped the rhythm of a woman's day. Once disrupted, her inner balance shifted with them. Eventually, the breakfast she preferred no longer appeared. A dish she once found comforting was replaced by something bland. A favorite cup vanished from the tray and returned days later, as though forgotten. The Queen understood that deprivation did not need to be dramatic. It only needed to be persistent. Hunger, even mild hunger, sharpened anxiety. A mistress who felt slightly weakened became more aware of her own fragility, more prone to doubt, easier to unsteady. Clothing followed the same pattern. Gowns were not denied, they were delayed. A garment she expected for a particular evening arrived only a moment before she needed it, forcing her to dress in haste. Another gown returned from the mender with small imperfections. Nothing visible from afar, yet enough for her to feel unprepared. On certain days, the fabric that should have felt soft held a faint stiffness, as though the laundress had washed it with too much vigor. These interruptions seemed accidental, but their timing was never random. She began to lose control of her appearance, without realizing why. A ribbon she favored could not be found. A set of sleeves she relied on for comfort was returned with the ties slightly uneven. Servants apologized, bowed, and promised to correct the errors. They always corrected them, but slowly. So slowly that the mistress's confidence thinned thread by thread. The Queen did not need to ruin her. She only needed to ensure that dignity slipped from her grasp in the quiet margins of the day. The most insidious change was the feeling of being forgotten. Servants who once greeted her quickly now arrived a little slower. Their footsteps echoed distantly before they reached her. She called a maid twice before receiving a response. A footman paused a moment too long before opening a door. These delays were not disrespectful, they were calculated. They created the sense that her presence mattered less, that her needs were no longer urgent, that the household around her functioned with or without her. This subtle neglect pierced deeper than hostility. Hostility could be confronted. Neglect dissolved identity. She began to wonder whether the king still favoured her, or whether the palace had shifted its loyalty back toward the Queen. She questioned her servants' devotion, misinterpreting their stillness as disinterest rather than obedience to another power. She sensed a faint coolness in the air, a quiet thinning of the world she once occupied with confidence. Servants executed these changes with immaculate calm. They did not raise their voices or alter their expressions. They moved with the same grace as before. Yet each movement carried a slight drag, a softened urgency. Their neutrality protected them. No single act could be labelled sabotage. Their work simply accumulated into a pattern that reshaped the mistress's days. They were the queen's reach, extended through routine rather than confrontation. The queen understood that a woman destabilized by daily disruption made mistakes. She forgot small details. She reacted emotionally to minor inconveniences. She pushed too hard for reassurance or withdrew too quickly into fear. These behaviors created new cracks that servants observed and reported, not through dramatic statements, but through the same quiet channels that had delivered the initial changes. Every gesture the mistress made became part of a feedback loop tightening around her. In time, she felt the palace turning against her, not through visible hostility, but through absence. Absent warmth, absent steadiness, absent recognition. Her meals tasted different. Her clothes felt unfamiliar. Her days lost their shape. These shifts did not destroy her directly, but they unstitched her from herself. And in a world where a mistress's value rested on composure, even a fraying edge could be fatal. Control, in Tudor life, did not need force. It only needed proximity, patience, and servants who understood exactly how fragile a day could be. Small disruptions circled her life with a quiet precision she never saw forming. A heavier tension entered the air each time routine slipped from her grasp. Once that tension settles fully into place, the ground beneath her may tilt in ways she cannot steady. Power, in a Tudor household, rarely announced itself with footsteps. It never needed to stand in a doorway, raise its voice, or identify its source. Instead, it moved like a slow breath beneath the surface, shifting the air 1 degree at a time until the person standing in the center felt unsteady without knowing why. For the mistress, this change began as a faint unease, a sensation that something familiar had tilted. Though nothing around her seemed visibly altered, she sensed it the way one senses weather turning, not through sight, but through the quiet ache of instinct. She noticed first that the palace seemed to watch her without watching. Conversations ended a little too cleanly as she approached. Servants' eyes remained lowered, perhaps longer than they needed to. The stillness in the corridors thickened, as if holding something she could not quite hear. Nothing was said outright. Nothing hostile was shown. Yet she felt the weight of something approaching. Slow and measured, the world around her had begun to reshuffle itself. In earlier days, she moved through the palace with the soft confidence of someone protected by affection. She believed the king's warmth formed a shield around her, one strong enough to push back the court's scrutiny. But the shield was never hers. It merely hovered near her. And now, she felt it thinning, not through any change in the king's behavior, but through the way the palace responded to her presence. Warmth had cooled. Routine had stiffened. Rooms that once welcomed her now held their silence differently. She tried at first to dismiss the feeling. She told herself the servants were tired, the palace was busy, and the court was distracted by matters unrelated to her. But intuition, once stirred, does not settle easily. She woke with tension clasped tight across her chest. She dressed with the uneasy awareness that someone somewhere had shifted a piece on a board she had not realized she was part of. When she looked into her mirror, she saw not fear, but alertness, an animal sense of being observed without witnessing the observer. She asked no questions. Questions revealed vulnerability, and she had learned that vulnerability was a dangerous currency in Tudor life. Still, she watched the servants more carefully. She tracked their movements the way they once tracked hers. She noticed how a maid's hands trembled briefly before smoothing her sleeves. She noticed how a footman who once greeted her warmly now paused just a fraction before bowing. She noticed how her name, when spoken in the distance, arrived with a tone she could not decipher. The uncertainty gnawed at her. It forced her into a restless vigilance. She replayed past conversations, past choices, Past glances exchanged with the king. She wondered whether she had misstepped, or whether the queen had finally begun to move against her. She wondered whether servants had betrayed her, whether rumours had surfaced, whether something small she once overlooked had grown into a shadow she could no longer escape. What she did not know was that the queen did not need to move directly. Influence did not push, it settled. It drifted into the places where doubt already lived. Servants, responding to the queen's stillness rather than her commands, tightened their restraint. They positioned themselves differently around the mistress, shifting just enough to create the sensation of distance. Against such subtle pressure, the mistress found herself unable to anchor her footing. A strange quiet followed her, not the respectful quiet she once enjoyed, but a quiet that carried the faint chill of being measured. She sensed people withholding something, not out of secrecy, but out of caution. She looked for signs of open hostility, but none appeared. Everything unfolded beneath the surface, shaping her fear precisely because it could not be named. Power had not touched her, yet she felt pressed. The queen had not spoken to her, yet she felt answered. The palace had not accused her, yet she felt judged. The pressure came from the invisible tension that seeped through routines, through glances, through delays measured in heartbeats rather than minutes. In time, her uncertainty became a living thing. It paced beside her, breathed with her, pulsed beneath her skin. She studied her reflection for signs of decline. She adjusted her voice to sound firmer. She tried to stand straighter, speak more brightly, laugh more easily. Each attempt grew weaker than the last. Power does not need confrontation to break someone. It needs only to let insecurity bloom. The mistress began to doubt her own memories. Had the king's tone softened recently? Or had she imagined it? Had the queen's attendants lingered near her room intentionally? Or were they simply passing by? Had a servant avoided her gaze out of guilt, respect, or something else entirely? She spiraled into questions that never reached answers, because the system confronting her was built on silence, not confession. Her world, once held together by the fragile assurance of affection, now felt porous. She clung to small routines, hoping they would anchor her, but even those routines betrayed her. Meals delayed, garments misplaced, greetings subdued. She sensed a tide shifting, slow and unstoppable. Power had not revealed itself, yet she felt its imprint. It pressed against her life without touching it, tightened around her without shouting, dismantled her confidence without lifting a hand. A quiet weight settled over her days, shaping fear from what she could not see. A deeper tremor stirred each time she searched for stability that refused to return. The moment that tremor becomes unmistakable, the world around her may begin to show its true design. Pressure in a Tudor household did not always come from the queen, the king, or the court. Often, it emerged from the narrow space between a servant's breath and a mistress's doubt. It lived in glances, pose, pied, and half-spoken sentences, forms so delicate that no one could accuse them of intent. Yet these were the very threads that tightened around the mistress's mind, weaving a quiet unease she could not shake. Servants, especially those aligned with the queen, understood the power of ambiguity. They never offered outright warnings. Instead, they delivered fragments disguised as casual conversation. A maid adjusting the mistress's gown might murmur, "The palace feels different today," without elaboration. A footman lighting candles might mention that the queen had been awake earlier than usual. A laundress returning garments might say she found a seam pulled tighter than expected. None of these remarks accused or predicted anything. They simply rested in the air, waiting for the mistress's fears to animate them. The mistress tried to ignore these moments at first. She reminded herself that servants gossiped, that they often spoke without thinking, that palace life bred exaggeration. But the comments arrived with increasing precision, always timed to coincide with her moments of uncertainty. When she felt strongest, the servants remained silent. When she doubted herself, they spoke. Their words felt less like observations and more like confirmations of something she had not yet identified. And then came the looks, carefully measured, never disrespectful, but holding too much awareness to be innocent. A maid fastening her sleeves held her gaze a moment longer than necessary. A servant opening her door let his eyes flicker toward her with restrained concern. A kitchen girl delivering food glanced at the tray before handing it over, as if to warn her without speaking. These looks said nothing, yet they conveyed everything. They told the mistress that others saw changes she had not acknowledged, that the palace watched her more closely than she believed. Silence carried the heaviest weight. A silence offered at the wrong moment could shake her more deeply than any spoken judgment. When she asked a question, and a servant hesitated before answering, the pause became an omen. When she voiced a simple request, and the room grew still, she heard meaning where there was none, or where none needed to be spoken aloud. Silence made her responsible for the dread she felt. Silence allowed her imagination to interpret the world around her with increasingly dark shades. Servants used this silence with extraordinary skill. They did not violate etiquette. They did not cross boundaries. They simply allowed pauses to stretch just slightly beyond comfort. They allowed their neutral expressions to hover a little too long. They allowed the mistress to sense that something unspoken drifted beneath their composure. These gestures were small, but smallness was their strength. The queen needed no decrees. The servants needed no instructions. They amplified what the mistress already feared. In time, she began searching for meaning in every movement. A maid folding linens seemed to hide a message in the rhythm of her hands. A guard speaking quietly near her door felt like a sign of surveillance. A servant's lowered head appeared to signal disappointment or pity. The mistress's mind, exhausted by doubt, filled in the blanks with her own insecurity. Psychological pressure did not work by delivering answers. It worked by making her desperate for them. She felt herself shrinking from spaces she once entered confidently. She avoided hallways where servants gathered, unwilling to risk hearing another ambiguous comment. She watched the queen's attendants from afar, sensing they carried knowledge she lacked. She felt the palace's atmosphere shift whenever she walked into a room, though she could not tell whether the shift came from others or from the tremor inside her. The servants did not need to escalate their efforts. The mistress herself did the work. Her fear turned whispers into warnings, glance into accusations, silence into judgment. Every moment became a mirror, reflecting her anxieties to her. By the time the queen's plan neared completion, the mistress was already unraveling internally. Her voice tightened. Her confidence dimmed. Her posture betrayed her. Psychological pressure had accomplished what rumor and observation alone could not. Even the king sensed the change, though he could not identify its cause. He noticed her restlessness, her sudden defensiveness, her fragile attempts at joy. He began to see her through the palace's eyes. Subtly guided by the emotional collapse she could no longer hide. The servants never spoke to him directly. They did not need to. Their quiet shaping of the mistress's world had already shifted his perception. Pressure without confrontation. Control without contact. Influence without accusation. This was the queen's power, channeled through those who understood how to bend the mind without raising the hand. The softest gestures unsettled her long before she understood their design. A deeper tremor gathered each time she tried to steady herself against shadows that refused to stay still. Once that tremor fills the space around her, even her own thoughts may turn against her. The mind bends long before the body does. Once pressure begins to coil beneath a mistress's days, pressure built from silence, from glances, from shifting routines, her behavior starts to fray in ways she cannot disguise. She tries to carry herself with the same soft composure that once protected her. But the stillness around her has changed. Every delayed meal, every mislaid gown, every ambiguous whisper has carved a small crack inside her. And now the cracks begin to show. She becomes impatient first. Not openly, not loud enough to draw attention, but sharp enough for servants to sense the tremor in her voice. When a maid ties her laces too slowly, the mistress exhales with forced restraint. When a tray arrives late, she touches the edge of the table with a tight, unsteady hand. Her movements lose their fluidity. The gentleness she once offered to hide her ambition falters. She speaks more quickly, then corrects herself. She reaches for objects with more force than necessary. She turns too quickly towards sounds that never used to bother her. Servants recognize these signs instantly. They have seen women unravel in smaller circumstances. A mistress who once floated through the palace now looks as though she is trying not to fall. She watches the doors too carefully. She checks her mirror more often. But each time she looks at her reflection, the certainty she seeks is absent. She can no longer tell whether the palace has changed or whether she has. Her impatience grows into urgency. She begins to seek reassurance from the king, with a frequency she never allowed herself before. She asks whether he will visit, whether he will dine with her, and whether he will return after council. She dresses earlier, hoping to catch him in a moment of vulnerability. She sends small notes, meant to appear light-hearted, but weighted with fear. Each unanswered message deepens her panic, though she hides the reaction poorly. The king, who once admired her youth or boldness, now senses the shift. Her laughter catches at the end, like a cord pulled too tight. Her touch clings. Her gaze searches his face for signs he never intended to display. She demands without meaning to. She worries without speaking the words. The queen's silence has done its work. The mistress is now performing the downfall for everyone watching. Her demands extend beyond affection. She wants assurances, gifts, gestures that anchor her to a world she feels slipping. She asks for new gowns more frequently, then rejects them when they arrive because they do not feel right. She asks to attend gatherings where her presence is neither required nor welcomed. She grows jealous of glances she imagines rather than sees. Her hunger for stability makes her more visible, more brittle. The court begins to notice, not through scandal or public error, but through the quiet misalignment of her presence. A mistress who once moved with instinctive awareness now steps into rooms with an energy that disrupts the air. She speaks too quickly with courtiers and too softly with servants. Her emotions spill in small betrayals. A trembling lip, a tightened jaw, a look that lingers a moment too long. She tries to compose herself, but composure is a language she no longer speaks fluently. Servants observe her, unraveling with the calm that comes from expectation. They tighten their silence around her, and the silence becomes unbearable. When she asks a question, their answers are too polite. When she makes a request, their movements are too measured. She cannot tell whether they pity her or judge her. But she knows they see something she is losing control over. And then the true weakness emerges. The weakness she spent months trying to conceal. She becomes afraid of being replaced. She becomes afraid of being forgotten. She becomes afraid of being seen clearly. Her need for reassurance makes her careless. She reveals too much in her expressions. In her tone, in the way she clutches her sleeves. She stops hiding her anxiety. She stops protecting her pride. In Tudor life, fear was the most dangerous confession a woman could make. And she made it wordlessly, day after day. The queen does nothing. She does not speak to the mistress, does not rebuke her, does not interfere. She simply watches, letting the mistress exhaust herself. The queen does not need to attack. She only needs to let the collapse continue under its own momentum. A woman fighting for stability in a world already shifting against her creates her own downfall more efficiently than any rival could orchestrate. The palace reads the mistress's weakness like a book left open on a table. Her impulsiveness becomes a sign. Her demands become a burden. Her trembling becomes an omen. By the time she realizes how exposed she has become, the court has already adjusted its alignment. Inching quietly toward the queen, she tries to recover her composure, but regaining control is far harder than losing it. Her days have changed shape too completely. Her nights bring little rest. She wakes with fear pressing against her ribs. Her gestures grow sharp, then exhausted, then resigned. She has become the reflection of her own unraveling, and the palace sees it before she does. Her own reactions betrayed her faster than any rumor could. A heavier strain entered her voice each time she tried to steady what was already slipping away. The moment that strain deepens further, her unraveling may become impossible to hide. A shift in the household's rhythm often signals the moment the wife has been waiting for. It never comes with noise or ceremony. It arrives like a faint tightening in the air that only those who have endured long silence can recognize. By the time she acts, her calculations have already stretched across weeks, sometimes months, gathering small advantages that settle quietly into place. A Tudor wife never lunges. She waits until the king grows weary. The court grows restless, and the mistress begins to show the first cracks of fear. It starts with subtle lapses in the king's attention. He no longer lingers at the mistress's door. His enthusiasm cools, not in dramatic withdrawal, but in a thinning of gestures, a shorter visit, a delayed gift, a conversation that ends before it truly begins. He leans away rather than toward. His eyes drift to other concerns. Even as he tries to pretend nothing has shifted, he does not realize his distance has already been noticed by the one who shares his public life rather than his private indulgence. A wife senses these changes long before the mistress dares to. She watches during meals, during counsel, during the smallest interactions. She observes how he no longer defends the mistress in conversation, how he hesitates before mentioning her, how he avoids the topic of affection with a discomfort he cannot quite name. She files each sign away, adding it to the silent ledger she has kept since the affair began. Her restraint is not born of helplessness. It is born of long practice in reading a man who rarely understands his own shifting desires. Then the court begins to tilt. Courtiers adjust their posture around the wife, offering slightly deeper bows or allowing their compliments to linger a breath longer than before. Their instincts are sharp. They always align themselves with the direction they believe power is turning. Servants grow quieter around the mistress. Gossip becomes slower, heavier, and more deliberate. Rumors no longer protect her. They outline her decline with a precision that seems accidental but never is. The mistress senses unease, but cannot trace its source. She reaches too quickly for reassurance, speaks too loudly in moments that require softness, and misreads the king's silences as offences she must correct, rather than warnings she must heed. She pushes when she should wait. She demands when she should withdraw. Every misstep deepens her vulnerability. A wife waits for this imbalance to settle fully. She allows small inconveniences to accumulate around the mistress. A delayed message, a gown returned unfinished, a request quietly reshaped into denial. None of these are direct attack. They are disturbances that mirror the emotional instability the mistress now radiates. The palace absorbs these disruptions without protest, as if acknowledging the shift in authority. Once these currents flow in the same direction, king, uncertain, court, watchful, mistress fragile, the wife moves with calculated ease. She does not accuse. She does not expose. She offers something softer, something far more effective than confrontation, a reminder. Sometimes it comes as a gentle remark about lineage. Sometimes it is a subtle nod to duty or devotion. Sometimes it is simply a presence. Steady, dignified, impossible to dismiss. These gestures settle in the king's mind, with more force than any argument. He begins to reevaluate his loyalties, not because she pressures him, but because she gives shape to the discomfort he has already begun to feel. He convinces himself that his decision is his own, and that illusion is what allows the wife's influence to unfold without resistance. The mistress, meanwhile, spirals into desperation. Her footing slips. Her demands grow sharper. Her fears seep into every movement. The court notices. Servants notice. Even the king notices, though he does not admit it aloud. Vulnerability becomes the cloak she cannot remove, and it exposes her more brutally than scandal ever could. At last, the decisive moment appears. It might be a minor breach of etiquette, a poorly timed plea, a misinterpreted gesture. What matters is not the act itself, but the atmosphere surrounding it. The king sees an inconvenience. The court sees instability. The wife sees an opportunity. She steps forward quietly, offering a single phrase, a suggestion, a reassurance, a carefully chosen truth. It lands with the precision of an arrow. He listens. He decides. He withdraws. The mistress is left within a shrinking world, one where her name fades from conversations and her presence becomes an echo rather than a force. Her downfall requires no public punishment. The wife has mastered something far more potent, the art of letting others dismantle themselves. Her patience carved the path that force could never secure. A single gesture pressed gently into an unraveling moment was all she needed. And in the space created by that unraveling, another kind of silence begins to rise. The retreat typically begins before anyone realizes what it means. Servants who once moved with deliberate attentiveness around the mistress now shift their paths with softened steps, leaving fewer traces of their presence. Their silence grows heavier, yet less focused. They no longer pause near her doorway, no longer linger behind curtains, no longer tilt their heads as if waiting for a whispered clue. It is not mercy that pulls them away. It is completion. They step back because the structure that held their attention has already begun to fall inward, without a single push from their hands. No one announces this withdrawal. A servant does not declare that their work is done. Instead, the palace absorbs a new stillness that spreads through corridors once taut with scrutiny. The mistress walks through these spaces, unaware of how exposed she has become. She interprets the fading presence as indifference, not as a quiet acknowledgement that she no longer matters. The palace does not watch what cannot affect its balance. In Tudor households, irrelevance is a form of exile that arrives long before physical removal. The wife understands this silence more clearly than anyone. She has seen it before. The moment when a network of eyes and ears dissolves, thread by thread, because the information it once sought has become unnecessary. Her own stillness deepens, not triumphant, but settled, as though she has simply allowed the natural order to return. She does not celebrate. She does not need to. A woman in her position learns that victory thrives in understatement. Power is at its strongest when it requires no further movement. What remains striking is how quickly the mistress feels the absence. Watchfulness once pressed against her from all sides, now the pressure loosens, and she mistakes the void for relief. She assumes she has regained privacy. She imagines she has reclaimed ground she never truly held. She walks a little taller, unaware that this confidence blooms in soil already too dry to sustain her. The moment she feels safest is often the moment she stands closest to collapse. Servants adapt swiftly to the new order. Those who once reported the rhythm of her mornings now transfer their attention back to established hierarchies, the wife's needs, the king's shifting moods, the responsibilities that ensure their positions remain secure. Their movements tighten into disciplined routines. They are careful not to display favoritism, not to be seen in lingering conversation, not to risk association with someone whose star has dimmed. In Tudor courts, a servant's survival depends on distancing themselves from those who fall out of favour. At the same time, no servant openly abandons her. They execute tasks when summoned, deliver items when required, keep their faces void of expression. But there is no longer a sense of alertness, no subtle anticipation, no shadow of protective instinct. Their neutrality becomes a barrier she cannot cross. She asks questions they answer too briefly. She makes requests that take longer to fulfill. She senses the thinning loyalty, yet cannot articulate it. It is a kind of loneliness that feels atmospheric rather than personal. The king contributes to this shift without intending to. His decreased attention ripples outward, altering the gravitational pull of the household. A king's interest dictates the court's behavior, and when that interest fades, every gesture surrounding him adjusts. Servants read these signals long before the mistress does. They reposition themselves accordingly, guided not by affection or resentment, but by survival, the purest instinct in palaces where proximity to power can be dangerous. As her world loosens around the edges, she begins to misread her own instability. She believes she is being punished, though no punishment has been declared. She believes the wife has ordered this silence, though the wife remains quiet. The truth is simpler and harsher. The palace no longer invests energy in someone who cannot alter its direction. Her downfall has reached a stage where intervention is unnecessary. She is unraveling in plain sight, and the architecture of court life has merely stepped aside to let gravity continue its work. A few servants pity her, but pity is as useless as loyalty at this stage. They keep their distance. They whisper among themselves in low, non-committal tones. They avoid engaging too deeply, knowing how quickly sympathy can be misinterpreted. Their withdrawal becomes the final confirmation that her influence has evaporated. A woman once watched from every angle is now not watched at all. The wife, for her part, requires no further involvement. She does not need to speak the mistress's name or comment on her condition. Her authority is affirmed through restraint, not force. She has mastered the quiet art of letting consequences unfold organically. Every decision she has made, every gesture, every silence, has led to this moment where her presence alone sustains the balance of the household. To the outside world, nothing dramatic has occurred. Doors open and close with the same weight. Meals are served at predictable hours. The king maintains his schedule. Yet, beneath the surface, a subtle victory has crystallized. The mistress has become unnecessary, and no one is required to say so. Their withdrawal unfolded with a quiet certainty the mistress never recognized. A delicate shift settled into the palace, as her fall continued without a single visible hand guiding it. What gathers in that settling silence may touch far more than the woman who stands at its center. Their fate rarely resembled anything dramatic. When the struggle had ended, quietly, as all palace struggles do, the servants resumed their duties with an almost unsettling fluidity. They had lent their eyes, their hands, their silence to a battle that was never theirs. And yet the palace swallowed them back into its rhythm as though nothing had happened. The corridors felt unchanged. The routines continued. And the servants who had shaped the rise or fall of a mistress learned again how to walk without leaving any imprint behind. Some of them were rewarded, though reward in Tudor courts did not necessarily mean transformation. A small increase in wages, a slightly warmer chamber, a place closer to the Queen's retinue. These were considered generous acknowledgements. A servant who had risked reputation, employment, or even physical danger might receive nothing more than a nod or a brief phrase spoken in the wife's measured tone. Those who served powerful women understood that gratitude, like loyalty, was a currency dispensed sparingly. Acknowledgement itself became a luxury. Others were quietly reassigned. They were moved to different wings of the household, or to tasks unrelated to surveillance, not as punishment, but as recalibration. A servant associated too closely with the downfall of a mistress could easily become a symbol of tension, even if they had acted with discretion. Shifting their duties protected the broader balance of the palace. Tudor households valued smooth surfaces, not visible agents of disruption. These servants accepted the change with lowered heads, aware that survival depended on flexibility rather than pride. But most were simply forgotten. They blended again into the background. Those same men and women who had once carried secrets with perfect precision, who had known what the mistress whispered, who had tracked the king's movements with uncanny accuracy, who had fed information into the quiet hands of a wife, sharpening her advantage. Their contribution evaporated as soon as it succeeded. No one asked for their recollections. No one recorded their involvement. They were swallowed back into the machinery of daily labor, the kingdom's invisible infrastructure. The palace made them essential only when someone else's fate required it. In the aftermath, a subtle stillness surrounded them. They did not boast, for boasting was dangerous. They did not confide in each other, for servants knew how quickly alliances could be misread. Their silence once again became practical rather than strategic. They brushed past one another with soft steps, carrying linens, preparing meals, tending fires, polishing stone floors, tasks that suggested a world untouched by intrigue. Only their eyes hinted at the memory of what they had witnessed. And even that glimmer faded as days folded into weeks. Some felt a quiet pride in having served their mistress, whether queen or king's wife, with precision. Others felt unease, knowing their actions had nudged another woman toward ruin. But none allowed these feelings to surface. A servant's conscience was a private burden. And in Tudor courts, privacy itself could be a rare mercy. They carried their reflections with them, tucked behind the stillness of their expressions, where no passing noble would ever think to look. There were times when one of them would reappear at the edge of another conflict. A new mistress rising, a wife repositioning herself, a shift in alliances within the household. Their skills were not forgotten, only temporarily dormant. A servant who knew how to observe without being observed, who remembered small details, who could thread fragments of information into a larger pattern. Such a servant was never truly idle in a world ruled by intimacy and suspicion. Yet even in those moments, their purpose remained temporary. They were instruments, not legacies. Tools are used only long enough to carve the next outcome. History rarely speaks of them. Chronicles name kings, queens, wives, and mistresses. They record alliances, scandals, marriages, and dismissals. But the servants who shaped the flow of information, who knew what to look for, when to speak, when to disappear, remain beneath the surface. Their absence from the official record is not an oversight. It is evidence of how efficiently they learned to vanish once their work was complete. The palace relied on this invisibility. A servant who demanded recognition threatened the balance that kept the household functioning. So they melted quietly back into their routines, bearing neither triumph nor regret, only the calm acceptance of their station. The struggle ended, the pattern resumed. The woman they had helped dethrone faded from the palace corridors, and the servants who carried the story watched her absence unfold like a slow, predictable dusk. Their hands shaped the outcome, yet their names dissolved into the corridors they swept. A faint calm settled around them once the struggle no longer required their presence. In that calm, a quiet, shifting thread begins to form, hinting at forces that may surface long after their footsteps fade. History often pretends to speak with confidence, but its voice is built from fragments, letters that survived by accident, chronicles polished for noble eyes, testimonies bent by fear or ambition. Behind all of those polished surfaces lies an unseen scaffolding of small movements, quiet exchanges, glances that lasted only a moment, and servants who carried truths they never claimed. Their footsteps threaded the palace floors long after candles were extinguished, and each step helped shape the fates of people whose names would dominate the margins of history books. Yet the servants themselves remained unrecorded, not because their influence was small, but because it was too subtle for the world to name directly. A king believed he ruled with proclamations. A queen believed she held power through lineage. A mistress believed she rose because of beauty or charm. But the servants observed all three, and understood that the true engine of palace life was neither authority nor affection, but information, the soft details that slipped out in exhaustion, the whispered complaints spoken while hair was being braided, the letters tucked beneath the mattress for only a moment. All these offerings passed first through the hands of those who were presumed unable to harm, and that presumption was the palace's quietest mistake. Servants learned to move as though their bodies were made of air. Their presence blended into the background, their absence was rarely noticed. They swept floors while memorizing conversations. They poured wine while calculating the tone of a king's voice. They dressed their mistress while studying marks on her skin, traces that spelled out secrets she never intended to share. They folded linens while recalling patterns that might betray the timing of a clandestine visit. They did not need to search for information. The palace breathed it out naturally, and they merely learned how to collect it. And then came the more delicate skill, knowing when to release it. A servant never delivered news abruptly. Information in Tudor courts moved like a slow tide, shaping conclusions without declaring itself. A detail repeated twice, a hesitation at the wrong moment, a question framed too casually, a pause during dressing. The wife who listened understood that truth rarely arrived whole. It gathered itself piece by piece, arranged by the intuition of those beneath her station. When she finally acted, her decisions appeared measured, almost inevitable, as though the world had simply turned in her favor. No one saw the servants standing behind that inevitability. Their influence held a paradox. It was strongest when unacknowledged. A servant who pushed too visibly risked suspicion. A servant too loyal to one side risked exposure. A servant too clever risked removal. So they learned restraint until restraint became its own form of survival. Their mastery lay not in action, but in calibration. When to step close. When to step back. When a silence was more potent than a revelation. Through these small adjustments, tides shifted, alliances strained, and a mistress who once believed the palace adored her found herself dissolving into dread without knowing where its source began. The palace always carried the illusion that power resided in those who held titles. Yet titles were loud, and loudness leaves traces. Servants, on the other hand, moved in shadows, and shadows conceal their own footprints. They shaped the edges of every major turn, when a queen reclaimed her influence, when a king reconsidered his desires, when a mistress fell from favor without understanding the mechanism of her downfall. Servants saw these changes long before they became a public reality. They could sense a shift in the air long before the court caught its scent. And still, they remained nameless. In chronicles, their existence is reduced to a servant reported, or a maid observed, or a messenger informed. No names, no descriptions, no recognition. Their humanity dissolves into the function they served. Yet, it was precisely this invisibility that granted them their quiet authority. A named figure becomes dangerous. A nameless one becomes indispensable. They learn to navigate that border, to inhabit a role that allowed them to witness the truth without being consumed by it. The wives who relied on them understood the cost. A queen or noblewoman could not move freely, could not observe freely, could not ask too many questions without appearing insecure. Her station required distance, composure, and a mask of serenity. A servant filled that gap, slipping into places she could never enter, hearing what she could never hear, watching what she could never admit to watching. Their combined existence formed a single power, divided into visible and invisible halves. Without the invisible half, the visible one would collapse. Yet once the mistress fell, Once the struggle quieted, once the order of the palace readjusted itself, servants disappeared into their anonymity again. Their work dissolved into memory, their names scattered like dust. The palace praised no one for the information given at the right time. It blamed no one for the consequences that followed. Servants stepped back behind curtains, behind corridors, behind daily chores. The world resumed, and they resumed with it, carrying the knowledge of what they had shaped. Something is haunting that disappearance. Power exercised without acknowledgement. Influence without legacy. A life spent in proximity to danger, without the world ever realizing the blade passed through their hands first. Their silence became the final archive of truths that would never be written, never be taught, never be told. And yet, history depends on them. Not the grand history of kings and battles, carved into monuments, but the intimate history of households, marriages, betrayals, and private wars. The kind of history that shapes destinies quietly before the world notices a shift. The kind of history your eyes would miss, but your instincts would feel. They carried this history, tended it, guided it, and let it fall into place without ever expecting gratitude. In that sense, they were the truest authors of Tudor reality. Writers whose ink was movement, whose parchment was silence, whose stories were never fully theirs, but could never unfold without them. And now, as the night deepens around this tale, it becomes easier to imagine one of those servants standing at the edge of a dim corridor, holding a sliver of truth that could alter someone's fate with a single step. They breathe steadily, neither hurried nor afraid. They have done this before. They will do it again. And the world above them will continue pretending that only nobles steer history. But you, listening here, now know better. Thank you for staying through this quiet, heavy journey. Rest well. May your sleep be soft. May your mind drift gently. And may the shadows of Tudor corridors settle into silence as you close your eyes tonight.